All right, I believe we are live. So good morning to NASFiC attendees. We are here for the World Building Useful Adaptations for Disabled Characters panel. If you're looking for the flying monkeys, I think they're still at last night's party. You might need a TARDIS to find them at this point. I'm going to take a moment and let our awesome panelists introduce themselves, and we will get this show on the road. So let's go and start with Ace, please.
Hello, I'm Ace Tilton Ratcliffe. My pronouns are they, them. I'm a writer, multimedia artist, tends to dabble in more nonfiction than fiction, but a little bit of fiction here and there too. And I'm very excited to be here today.
Awesome. And Marike.
Hi, I'm Marieke Nijkamp. I'm a YA author, writer of graphic novels and comics. For the purposes of this, you probably maybe know me from my version of Barbara Gordon's Oracle, the Oracle code that came out earlier this year. My pronouns are completely optional. I have many conflicted feelings about pronouns and languages, but she, her, and they, them are usually okay. And I'm excited to be here.
Awesome. Day.
Hi, I'm Dale Muhammad and battling a very fussy black cat on my desk right now. Sorry, I'm a author, filmmaker, and actually a policy strategist. I'm a senior advisor with the federal government. And for many, many years, I was a lobbyist, and in particular related to this panel, I actually worked on a lot of disability policy as it relates to technology and worked a lot with the FCC and for things like that. So I thought it might be kind of fun.
And Elsa.
Oh no,
Oh,
I think
no.
Elsa froze again.
Oh no.
I think so. Elsa's been having some connectivity issues.
I'm Elsa Hunes, speculative fiction writer. And my Zoom seems to be crashing. But I will hop on this on my phone and join you momentarily.
All right, awesome. Well, we await for Elsa to...
It's working now, yay.
Oh, yay! Woo.
You're back.
I've finished my introduction. I won a Hugo Award, a Aurora Award, and a British Fantasy Award for my work on Disabled People Destroy Science Fiction, which is part of why this panel is happening, because we're going to destroy some things. Yay!
Yay! Destruction on a Sunday morning is always awesome. My name is Raven Oak. I am your moderator. I'm a science fiction and fantasy author out of the Seattle area. I'm a disabled, geeky, non-binary person who also has issues with pronouns, like Marieke said. So, you know, she, her, or they, or them works for me. I'm not really picky because I'm more agender than non-binary, I guess. But
Ooh, agender high five.
yeah. So let's talk a little bit about the terms that we're using, because some people who are able, who may not know a lot about the disabled community, may not be familiar with terms like accommodations and adaptive, assistive, and corrective, like what the differences are between all of these words when we use them. And so if we could take a moment, and I'll kind of let you guys hop in where you want, quick, you know, short and sweet definition or differences between these terms for us.
Where shall we start?
Well, the easiest one would be, first statement might be, the federal government alone has more than 53 definitions of disability as of last count. So anything we say here, you know, keep in mind all sorts of caveats there. How's that for an opening?
There you go. There you go.
Good opening salvo. Yeah, I think maybe a really good place to start, especially for non-disabled people, is to let everyone know that disability encompasses mental illness, physical disability, I mean, there's a broad, wide range of disabilities that are covered. And although it varies from person to person, I have found that especially within the disability justice community, our preference is disabled person, not person with a disability. And you could spend 18 years getting into person first language versus identity first language, but I have a feeling most of us are going to agree on this panel.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, maybe to add to that too, especially if you're non-disabled yourself, like if it's self-ID, that's perfectly fine. But if you're non-disabled, do stick to either disabled person or person with a disability, no differently abled, handicapable, or other things that make me want to vomit.
I was gonna say you're gonna make me puke off screen.
And I'll throw in too, because we're talking about what makes a disability. Like, yeah, there are 53 different definitions of disability according to the federal government. But even within that, individual disabilities vary from person to person.
Mm-hmm.
I went to guide dog school last year. We had 14 people in one class. All of us were blind. Literally none of us had the same type of blindness. It didn't manifest the same way. It didn't look it. Some of us could see something, some of us could see nothing. There was a complete variety, and that's across the board for all disabilities. Everybody's disability is a little different.
We're not interchangeable. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Disability is not a monolith. Neither is any sort of marginalized experience, for that matter.
Nope.
Imagine that. We're individuals.
I know, right?
All right. Well, I know that for me being, I guess, somewhat new to my disability, my physical disability anyway, when I've heard terms like accommodations or adaptive or assistive, for the most part, they've been used interchangeably. It was more the corrective that I'd heard recently that was newer to me. So I was kind of looking at that question as more of a, is there a difference in those terms that I'm missing that I'm not aware of? Because if I'm not aware of it being fairly new to us, I know that a lot of abled people are not as well. So is that something in the community that you can use those terms interchangeably, and not be offensive, I guess would be the question.
So the example that I came up with for this when I constructed this panel was thinking about different kinds of adaptive devices.
Mm-hmm.
So able-bodied people get real excited on Twitter when somebody decides to post a photo of, say, a wheelchair with treads that can go upstairs, or a massive exoskeleton pair of legs that you have to strap yourself into like half of a mecha, and it'll help you walk, because of course walking is the ideal, right? And this is where we all twitch. These ideas of we can make you better and we can fix it so that you fit into the able-bodied world, instead of an adaptive device that lets you adapt to the world. So like, my guide dog helps me get around just fine, or my white cane works just fine. It's not changing my body to fit into an able-bodied world. It's helping me adapt to it. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right. And that was the clarification I was hoping for, was just to make sure that everybody understood a little more detail about what we mean by adaptive and what we mean by, in the description talking about the disabilities not mattering, because obviously they matter. So when we talk about adaptive devices, Elsa, you just mentioned, the mech suit for walking, being not a good example of one. What types of adaptive devices are we as a community looking for when we're looking for representation in fiction? Like, what would you like to see?
I mean, I think in terms of just sort of future world building, I want to see us looking at things like cyberpunk and, 15 minutes in the future stuff that's not erasing the disability. Because that's a lot of what I tend to see in science fiction is, well, we can just make you better. We don't have to actually engage with the fact that you have a disabled body. One of the examples of that would be Geordie LaForge's visor, which I love Geordie, but Geordie's adaptive device basically makes it so he can see.
Mm-hmm.
Question mark on that one. Any other thoughts from people? Help.
So I've got actually an actual great real world example. And so I'm going to pick something a little controversial, right? Cochlear implants, right? For folks who are abled in general, the idea is, isn't this great? People who could never hear can now, hear again. And it's like, but there's not a recognition that it doesn't work the same way. It doesn't necessarily hear the same way. And by putting in that technology, it destroys any residual hearing. And never mind the fact that what it does when you're talking about folks who might be culturally deaf, right? This is a community, and this actually breaks away from that. But so I don't want to get too caught into that. But so there's this piece of technology that, as far as able people are concerned, allows folks to hear to some extent, but it is not perfect, and it really is limited in group situations and multiple areas. But the example is a lovely man in, I want to say it's Poland. I think it's Poland. I'm going to be wrong now. But, and he actually, his implant was set wrong. And so he was talking to some friends about the noise he kept hearing, that this high pitch over the city at night. And it was the bats. It was set up in such a way that he was supposed to be for hearing people, but it was set up so broadly he could actually hear the bats over the city at night.
Oh, wow.
And he thought that was wonderful. He actually was trying to talk to the company, can I enhance this so I could actually hear them better and follow them, because that would be super awesome. And that's technology that exists now. And in some ways it allows for some kind of, I don't want to say superhuman, but really some things we wouldn't expect. It still doesn't work well for human speech necessarily every time, but that's neat. Now, here's where dystopian stuff comes in. That implant was built by a company, is owned by a company, and they basically said, we will not change this, and you cannot change this, because if you do, it will not only just void your warranty, we will take it back.
No.
So basically, this outside entity controls what this man can hear. But you want to talk 15 minutes in the future? How awesome is that? Can hear the bats over the city at night. So,
Wow.
sorry, I left us into the negative side as well. But it's very real, and this is a very true story right now.
I'll also point out that one of the things about cochlear implants that I personally find frustrating is that able-bodied people reach for them as plot devices a lot. And one, they don't actually solve all kinds of hearing loss. It's not a one-size-fits-all solution. And two, you literally have to drill a hole into your head to get one. So like, it's not an easy solution. It's not, we put something in your skull to make you hear better. Like,
Right. And that's not even to get into the complications of being in America and insurance.
Mm-hmm.
We do have a couple of questions that I'm noticing over here in the chat.
Yeah, I noticed a couple of too. I know that looks like Jay is asking what the difference between a wheelchair and a mech suit is.
I mean, that's a pretty big question. I think ultimately what we're talking about here, and honestly, Jay, you're going to have to spend some time, I think, on your own doing research to really get into the nuances of this. And I think that if this is kind of your first experience having this conversation, you're going to likely have a gut feeling where you disagree with us, because I think a lot of non-disabled people feel that way. But the reality is that a lot of, not all of, disabled people, we don't want a mech suit. We don't want to be fixed. We don't want a different version that adds accessibility in a way that makes us closer to non-disabled. I don't want to get rid of my wheels. I like my wheels just fine. I take a wheels over, well, I mean, I guess if we were talking about Jaegers, maybe. But can't I be in the Jaeger in my wheels? I guess there's my question. I think really what it comes down to is we don't want to be fixed. And the version that everybody thinks of when dealing with disability involves us being fixed.
Well, and I especially don't want to be fixed in a way that requires more work for me. Like if I had to strap myself into a mech suit every day to walk, that's a lot of work for somebody who is disabled in the way that I am. I don't want to have to do more work to fit into an able-bodied world, if that makes sense.
So I also would argue, I think one of the toughest things is when we look at what people think of as the fix, they're missing a lot of what are the actual issues that somebody has with a disability, and what are the downsides of what are created. Like an exoskeleton sounds great, but look at the amount of effort it takes to strap into it every day. I'm like, dude, if I have to go pee, I'm like, you have to have it set up to get it in and out of that. I mean, let's there's a whole lot of other things. Over time, if you have paralysis, I know a friend who starts to have that bone degeneration within his lower extremities. Being upright doesn't necessarily solve that. In fact, it could make parts of that worse, meaning you start breaking more limbs down below without realizing it. So the thing is, what we think of as a fix could be problematic and cause a whole lot of other issues. It's like when it comes to various forms of mental health conditions, right? We have so many psychiatric medications, and if you look at the kinds of side effects of those, they are life-changing side effects. Things like seizures become seen as normal. Well, it's okay. You can manage your mental illness, but you might have seizures, and that's okay.
Or thinking about, again, fixes in future settings, okay, cool. You can give me sight in my right eye again. That's great. My brain rewired itself to see very poorly out of one eye. I have questions about how long it would take for me to learn how to read, walk, cook, do everything that I do now. That's going to take time. Your body adjusts to being what it is. So if you suddenly are like, oh, hey, look, you're able-bodied now. It's like, how long is that going to take? I don't want to.
I think to this point too, because there's another comment coming from chat from someone saying, I would rather have those exoskeleton legs in my cane though. Like, it's definitely good to keep in mind that when it comes to fixes, when it comes to pretty much any discussion in disability community, people's opinions are going to differ. I would rather have my cane than an exoskeleton. That doesn't change the fact that someone else might think differently, that we have different approaches to what works for us, what kind of adaptations and forms of access we would like. I think what is important to keep in mind, especially when having conversations about fixes, is who has the conversation, like who starts the conversation, what is the underlying thought about having conversations like these. If it comes from a disabled point of view, I am perfectly happy accepting pretty much any perspective. If it comes from a non-disabled point of view, or even an insurance point of view, or this ableist idea of what is right and perfect and the right way to be human, not so much. But do keep in mind that when you hear us talking about what we would like and what we would like to see, that's still only our perspective on the whole situation. And as people in chat point out, there are others who think differently, and those opinions and those viewpoints are just as valid.
Yeah. And I think that involvement of disabled people is so important. So frequently when you see the latest iteration of the walking mech suit, and then you go and you look at the team who's designed the walking mech suit, first off, there's very rarely, if ever, disabled people actually on that team. But secondly, and I have to use the word here, the inspiration for the walking mech suit is so frequently like, I have a mom, sister, brother, so on and so forth, who is disabled, and I wanted to fix this for them. And I think a lot of times, to get into the complications, we're talking about making this body closer to what is being the right human, as you were saying. And we're not talking about the structures that are in place that are causing ableism and inaccessibility and a difficulty with access.
I had a conversation with a friend a couple of years ago, and I actually wrote about this in my essay for Disabled People Destroy Science Fiction. But we were having conversations about, hey, the world is super ableist and super inaccessible to most people. Should we not do something about that? And he was like, what if we just fixed all disabilities instead, though? I was like, well, First of all, fuck you. Second of all, no. People are still, there's this weird idea about disability too, and you have to forgive me, I had a migraine yesterday, so my brain is still a bit fuzzy. But disability is not something like, obviously for some of us, disability is something we're born with. It was for me. I've been chronically ill my whole life. I've been autistic my whole life. I didn't just get that because of vaccinations, I don't think. But people are still going to get hit by cars. People are still going to get old. Like, bodies deteriorate. That is human life.
And
It is ridiculous to think that we should just fix everything instead of doing the far more simpler option of just making sure the world is accessible to all of us, and in the way we want it to be accessible, and in the way we want to be ourselves.
I also want to point out something that happens in Ada Palmer's Terra Ignota series, and I'm sure it happens in other books, but in the future, there will be new fancy disabilities.
Oh yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Look,
when your brain just can't connect to the neural net. There's something about the way that your brain processes electronic pulses that means you can't use that technology. Suddenly, your disability is being cut off from the neural net. Hello?
2018 wasn't particularly prepared for long-haul COVID either. So the world changes. People change with it.
Right. And I think the problem is that in general, society is attached to the idea that the ideal body, right? The ideal body is the 2 arms, 2 legs, 2 eyes, ears that work within a certain scale, right? And disability supposedly is the idea, like, you know, picture a spectrum at this end, and this is where I go, this is society mainstream perspective, please keep it that way. This end, you've got someone with a significant disability, and like and then moving up, you've got, hey, this is like what the average, I'm throwing out all the offensive terms there, human is, all the way up here to, let's say, Olympic athletes, because they're supposed to be these ideal physical specimens. And this is what we have built, saying this is what humans look like. And disability supposedly is on the far left of the spectrum, right? But what happens when you start seeing Olympic athletes with disabilities who are starting to operate at the level of Olympic athletes? Doesn't that start to break that spectrum looking at? And I hate using Pistorius because he's an asshole, a murdering asshole. You know, but this is a guy missing 2 legs who runs better than 90% of the rest of us, right? With or without disabilities. So shouldn't that put him on that far right? But he's still missing 2 of his legs. So doesn't that put him on the far left? So when we think about the idea of what the ideal human body looks like based on this spectrum we've been taught, people with disabilities in many ways, especially with accommodations, starts to break down. You know, the idea of 2 arms and 2 legs. Well, what if suddenly we could add 2 extra arms for people, right? Suddenly you have a person who's doing the jobs that 3 people did, and they're much better at it. Does society then change and say that's amazing? And now you guys with 2 arms are the ones with the disabilities? And that's where I think Elsa's idea of what the future looks like starts to change a little bit. We are very attached to this meat bag of what we should look like, right? And maybe we should start to think about, why are we so attached to this should and this perfect ideal when once you start looking at that spectrum and accommodations, we're already breaking that apart.
Also, let's be real here, space would change a whole lot. Like, I was on a panel a couple years ago at the Nebulas, and we were talking about what happens when you start to adapt for space. And I kind of wandered up to Kjell Lindgren, an actual astronaut, and I was like, hey, question for you. So you don't really need working legs in space, it sounds like. Question. How do you feel about, I don't know, prosthetic hooks to get around a spaceship? And he's like, yeah, that would work just fine. So it seems to me like being disabled in space is not really that big of a deal.
Well, and not even really a big deal, but also what space does to the human body is it fundamentally alters it. You know, if you're looking at, for example, the twins, whose names, of course, now I can't think of, but they've come back, and what they've experienced in coming back after spending a lot of time is really similar to my postural orthostatic tachycardic syndrome. And so I think we also need to be talking about, like, what does space, or will space, do to the body? You know, my reading yesterday, the person that I was writing, their eyes have been altered by the extracranial pressure, which is going to change your vision. They have a second heart because their vascular system wants to push all of the fluids up into their shoulders and their heads. Like, space is going to change the body and the way that it works here within our gravity well on Earth.
Yeah.
Well, and you also get into the fact that as people who are writing spec fic, if we think about the potential of alien species out there, the potential of life out there, it more than likely doesn't look like us. So this concept of us being expecting that normalcy and what, you know, people look like or should look like, as Day was talking about, of having 2 arms and 2 legs and things like that, is very you know, Earth centric, and
Yeah. It's not Star Trek.
yeah, it's not, it doesn't have us set up very well to be open to the idea of life looking different from us. We have so many problems with the other as it is.
Yeah.
And so if we're writing science fiction works, we should be trying to push that narrative that disabled people aren't broken. You know, we may look different, we may move differently and do things differently and require some more, you know, adaptation to what we do, but we're not that lower end of the spectrum as Day was talking about. Maybe that will help people understand, you know, alien species better as also being, you know, not that different from us.
Mm-hmm.
And I think maybe that's also the part of it, is some of that idea of the spectrum of where people are on it is based on perception. It's based on the lies we've gotten for years from media and television that says people with disabilities are not as good as X. Hey, Elsa, how good are you with a sword? Do you think do you think you could beat about 50% of the people who might be in the audience, not knowing who you guys are?
Yeah, probably.
Right. So you have a blind person who says they can kick your ass with a sword. You know,
Actually, deaf-blind person can kick your ass with a sword.
Mhm.
there we go. And part of it is because the belief is, of course, how could somebody do that? They can't do that at all. And I love these examples because I'm like, hey, I am number 6 in the United States in women's veteran foil. So unless you guys are 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, I will kick your ass. Nobody's going to say a blind person could do that. There's no, you know, we don't have any accommodations usually, or nothing technological. It's just what is learned and what is done out of skill. And so a lot of times when they're world building, they come up with technological cures for things that might not necessarily have been a problem to start with. And without really an understanding of how disability actually works, right? So I think that's why, in many ways, people will say they'll create the full cure, or they'll create the technology that completely erases the disability, because we cannot fathom that if you have a disability, you can accomplish something, or you can be successful, or you can lead your own story. And that, I think, is the biggest problem when we talk about world building and disability.
Oh yeah. I mean, to that extent too, Ace, you just mentioned Star Trek. Just the sheer fact that most Star Trek ships still have steps and stairs is ridiculous.
Yeah. I wrote about that for IO9, about why there are so many staircases in space. And that really goes back to, again, the fact that we're not having disabled people included in the world building.
Jay, all of us, by the way, please hire us for your writers' rooms.
Yeah,
yes.
please. Jay over in the Discord said something that I think is really great. I want the concept of disability to move away from divergence from a norm to issues with function and experience as defined by the people who live with it. And I think that that's
Brilliant.
such an important part of world building. Like, if you're going to be building a world with disabled people, and you should be, because we exist in every world that's out there,
Yep.
you have to, if you are not disabled, if you don't have that experience, your research needs to involve disabled people, which means your life needs to involve disabled people, which means you need to be following disabled people, consuming media with disabled people in it. Like, we need to be part of your experience. Otherwise, you're going to be imagining worlds where we don't exist.
Mm-hmm. Also, statistically speaking, your life involves disabled people. Just going by CDC stats, 1 in 5 adults in the US is disabled.
We're 25%.
Yeah, exactly. Stats on children
26.
are depend a bit. 26, that's it. Sorry.
It's gone up.
Yeah, yay.
Yay.
We are legion. Resistance is futile. One of these days. But like, statistically speaking, we exist in your lives. And if you don't have discussions about disability with the people around you, what are you even doing? Like, if you don't think we exist around you, you haven't been paying attention.
You know, I also think it's interesting in the US and I'm not sure about internationally, but at least in the United States, segregating disabled students out from the general school population is still acceptable. And so what happens is I have a lot of friends who are like, yeah, I've had friends who were in the special ed class, but like I only ever saw them for 5 minutes on the playground and then I never saw them again. And I'm like, yeah, so you had disabled classmates and you just didn't really pay attention. Like, I know people who have said to me, oh, you're the first blind person I've ever been friends with. You're the first deaf-blind person I've ever known. Or one point, I've had a couple people who I've dated who've been like, yeah, you're the only disabled person I've ever gone on a date with. And I'm like, okay, what kind of worlds are you living in that this is your experience? Because I'm very confused.
Accessible one.
Yeah. Well, and I think that that's really true. You know, when we talk about like New York City is always the one that I go to because it's supposed to be this bastion of like future thinking and like that's where everything happens. But when you talk about just the school district alone, I know that it's more than 80%. I want to say the stats are closer to 85% of schools, public schools in New York City are inaccessible to disabled kids. And so if you're talking about like people are starting from a very young age, the world that they're living in is one where they literally don't have disabled friends that they get to grow up with. And so of course, when they're writing as adults, of course, they're writing worlds that are inaccessible because that's what they know.
That's part of the importance of making sure we have representation in fiction, because I was a teacher in Texas for a good number of years. And you're correct, in certain areas of our country in the United States, you won't see disabled people in general population in a school at all. It was interesting to me that at one point in my teaching career, I was teaching at what was considered the school that carried the entire deaf ed population for the district. And so anyone in this huge city that was deaf had to go to one school. But they actually did a pretty good job of bringing them into the general classrooms. And so I had a good 10 students in multiple class periods of my computer class that were deaf and came with their interpreters. And for me, it was very eye-opening as somebody who grew up in areas that, again, I did not encounter very many disabled people, to see just how much, even though we think computers are fairly adaptive, how much they're not. Like, what's missing in that for my deaf ed students. And so if we can do more in our fiction to expose people who live in areas that are not normally exposed, that's helpful. I do have a comment that came from the chat area. Ragbone Hair actually had a really good definition also that said that I've heard it argued that non-disabled people should be described as temporarily abled because you're most likely to need some kind of accommodation at some point in your life. I was kind of curious to see what you guys thought of that.
I mean, I think that in some ways it's certainly accurate. I am a person who was technically born with a degenerative disease, but I didn't get a degenerative disease diagnosis until I was 26. And so up until the time that I was 26, I thought of myself as non-disabled. And I moved through the world as somebody who was non-disabled. And so I think that looking at it as, yes, at some point, you will become disabled by virtue of aging, accident, whatever. There is just something about temporary abled that makes my skin crawl, and I don't know that I could say why. I don't know why that makes me uncomfortable, but it does.
Yeah, it feels a little insulting, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's the reason I don't use it as a term, but as far as the concept behind the term, absolutely. And I had to double check, because it's like, so once you hit 65, the number of people with disabilities goes up to almost 50%.
Mhm.
So, you know, because and just the things that happen with aging, you're going to acquire disabilities. You're going to acquire things that interfere with activities of daily life, right? That's under that definition. So once you get to a certain point, it's going to hit everybody. We just have we tended to split off older adults and not think, we think of them as those are the old people versus those old people with disabilities. That these are things that can make it easier for their lives. And I think that's where we start to get where people start leaving out the idea that is much more broad, and it's much more relevant to a whole lot more folks. So yeah, so I'm like almost half when you hit 65. And I think at 50 that, you know, that numbers are still going to be higher. So we start at like 26% and it goes up from there.
Yeah.
I think the other
Well,
reason temporarily abled really makes my skin crawl is because not all of us have ever been able-bodied. I think I was able-bodied for about 2 weeks, and then that went away very quickly. And I mean, even saying that, it's like I was born with congenital rubella syndrome. Just because the effects of CRS hadn't really manifested yet doesn't mean they weren't there. I was completely blind within 2 months. I had lost my hearing, but nobody really noticed until I was 7. I had heart surgeries by the time I was 6 months. So like, I've never been able-bodied. So the idea of temporary ability, I'm just kind of like, but there are some people for whom that's not true. And I think it also kind of that term kind of erases the idea that some of us have maybe never been that way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's really accurate.
Yeah. One of the things that makes me really uncomfortable with the term is how it for a lot of people, disabled or disability is a really scary word that people would rather not use. And this feels like a way of tiptoeing around that, basically.
Yeah. And I think actually that's happening in the chat right now. Someone made the suggestion, better words, you're non-disabled or enabled. And like, nope. No, that falls under that whole concept of handy-capable, or, you know, whatever other adjective that you want to use for us. I think we're happy with the word disabled. That's what we are. It's not a scary term. And I think that if we stopped approaching it as it's something scary or lesser or any other negative adjective that you want to put on there, no, thank you.
Yeah, I think we're acknowledging, I'm so sorry, go ahead.
The thing that I say in the book that I'm writing is I talk a lot about how people really don't want to look at my body. They don't want to acknowledge the disability. People who I've known for decades will be like, well, I don't think of you as blind or deaf. I don't think of you as disabled. People, able-bodied people will do just about anything to not acknowledge that you have a disability. And that's why I think it's so important to say the word. Thank you, Lawrence Carter Long.
Well, that's like
hashtag.
that's like when people say they're colorblind, and it's erasure of, you know, the fact that this person is a person of color and has a culture behind them, that there's meaning in that. And so I think you can be correct with the possibility that, you know, temporarily abled can be erasure of the fact that disability exists, especially since, you know, Elsa brought up a good point with people don't want to look at the disability. They don't want to look at you. And so, because we're thinking about these things, one of the questions I really wanted to hit on was, when you're building your worlds, since this is supposed to be about writing and world building as well, when you're building these worlds, what areas do you think will be most influenced by your disabled characters and their adaptive tech or their adaptive devices? Will it laws, travel, economy? I mean, when people are world building, what do they need to be thinking about that they might not be thinking about?
Medical systems. The way that medical systems work in your world specifically for disabled people, especially if you're writing cyberpunk, is a big deal. Because we're talking Starfleet. How does Starfleet handle disability when it comes to treatment? What are the requirements for disabled Starfleet members? Those are the kinds of things that I start to think about. Like
or the very real example I just gave with the young man with this cochlear implant, and the company saying, if you alter this at all, we're going to take it away. Or that plays a big role in that. Is how much people have that control themselves with regard to some of that, and the costs. None of this stuff is going to come cheap.
Yeah. Well, and I think travel is a good one too that you mentioned, Raven. I think travel as a disabled person is drastically different than travel as a non-disabled person. And that kind of doesn't matter what you're talking about, like whether we're talking about the simplicity of being in a car, all the way up to airlines. Like traveling in a wheelchair is much more challenging. Just so many people don't know the stats about how many wheelchairs are damaged by airlines on a monthly basis, which they only just started reporting within the last, 18 months, less than 18 months. So travel, I think, is a really huge one. And of course, that again goes back to this idea of non-disabled people and disabled people being able to interact in the world together. If you can't travel, then how can you have a world where you are easily commingled?
Yep. And the guide dog is also highly entertaining.
So, and I'm going to put in a picture. If you put in any kind of ongoing conflict, as in related to wars, battles, I have a huge beef with a lot of military science fiction, insofar as you have wars.
Never disabled people. Yes.
Right. Or the technology is completely cured. I'm like, that's not going to happen, because there's so many varieties of injuries that come from that, where a prosthesis will not fit properly because of the way the limb has been mangled, or because of the brain damage that was done from concussive blasts. It's not going to connect to neural nets, like the example you gave previously. But there will be disabled people, and they may not want to use and this is still an issue actually with our current military. Most of them may not be as fond of using the word disabled. They'll say I was busted up instead. Yeah. And so there's still that divergence. But at the same time, they should be people with disabilities everywhere, gaining disabilities, living with them, adjusting to them as a part of anything that's got ongoing. And this goes for fantasy as well, not just science fiction, man. Go back and look at how many, not just knights, but folks in the fantasy time period had significant arthritis, were missing limbs, fingers, all sorts of things that came from a life lived in combat. So, so right there, you're going to hear my huge pet peeve. So please, if you have any kind of ongoing conflict, there should, even if it's far away, we're on this planet, but our young people go off to war. Guess what? They're going to be coming home too. So you should be showing that in your community. So I'm going to pause there, but that's my big beef with you guys. If you have anything with conflict, I want to see people with disabilities in your community.
As I said last year on a panel with Day at the Baltimore Book Festival, all your D&D characters have PTSD.
Yeah, someone was asking in the chat about the conflict over the current D&D combat wheelchair, and I just want to be like, dude, I fought spider rats last week in D&D. Yes, we can have a wheelchair, y'all. It's not complicated.
And they are kind of whippy. They were kind of cool little like minifigs. I was like, dude, that looks actually kind of neat. I want those.
Right? I ordered one.
Right? And they sent a little note. So you guys are thinking about putting service dogs in next, right? Because I want to battle.
Yeah.
Please have a service wyvern minifig. Please, please, please. Service wyvern.
That would be awesome.
Yeah. Also, hey,
Well, and I
just in
think-
case you didn't know, like dragons are totally historically accurate, and marginalized people came into existence like 5 years ago. That's how history
Yeah.
goes, right?
I am.
Well,
a
there were
fan-
no people of color in history, right?
No, definitely also no disabled people and queer people. And
God.
I don't know what I did during my medieval history degree, but like mostly just studied dragons.
What was my master's degree in obscenity law and burlesque about? I have no idea. I mean, there are no queer people and there are no women.
Nope.
I think one thing that I would also love to touch on too is that disability is not always visible. When I am in my wheelchair, you can tell that I'm disabled. And when I am not in my wheelchair, you absolutely cannot tell that I'm disabled. And I think that it's really important that we write worlds where disability isn't always something that you can physically grok
Yeah.
by touching or seeing or whatever verb you want to use there.
Right. And if we were to talk about just last quick points, I know a big one I want to do is we're talking some pretty heavy stuff here, but I'm like, disability in some ways can also be fun, and because we're fun, and to infuse that in there. And I will give a story. A lovely friend was with her sighted friends, and she has a little cane and was wandering around the Renaissance Fair, and they were going, and it's like, oh my God, psst, there's a hot guy, 6 o'clock. There's a friend. I'm like, really, right behind us? Yeah, he's coming up behind us. She's like, oh man, he's coming past us. Oh wait, and it's like. So she's like, watch this. So she taps ahead of them a few steps and then throws her cane in front of this guy. Oh, my cane, she says a little too loudly. And this guy picks it up and he presses it into her hand. Are you okay? Oh, thank you so much. And I'm like, really? And her, and he walks off and her friend's like, really? That's what you're going to do? And before she was going to get a guide dog, I'm like, what are you going to do next? Throw your guide dog in front of men? She's like, well, now that you mention it, they are very cute. There are things that we're going to do to get what we want, because the humor is a part of it too. It's part of who you are and how you live. We have disabilities. We have a friend with CP who falls because that's what's going to happen on uneven ground. And we used to have a joke because she hated the fact people would rush and try to help her up. And usually they're yanking her arms and she's like, I can get up on my own. You're messing with my balance. So she'd fall. And so we would stand her out and go, get up. You're embarrassing us. we learned last time, don't do that when there's too many other people around because they think we're being terrible to her.
I will share my entertaining, heartwarming story, which is the gentleman caller that I have at the moment. We were taking a walk about a week ago, and we're walking across the street, and I have my cane because my dog is currently being a jerk. And somebody had parked their car with their bike rack sticking out right next to where the crosswalk is. And what I hear from my right side is not, don't walk into the bike rack. What I hear is, sweetheart, can you just this way? Like, there's this almost imperceptible, I don't want to tell you not to run into that because I don't want you to yell at me, but also I really don't want you to run into
Don't walk into it.
Yep.
I'm just saying, hey baby, move that rack is what I was expecting to hear.
Yeah. We've got maybe 2 minutes left. So
Okay.
we'll let
Can
you
I
guys
say
wrap
my last
up.
thing?
Yep.
I have a last thing to say. My last thing to say is if you are not disabled and you are writing disabled people, as you should be, into your stories, get a sensitivity reader who is disabled.
Mhm.
And listen to
Pay the
them.
money and listen to them. Yes, please
Yes.
listen to them. We exist. We do the work. I have done the work for award-winning authors. I've worked for Tor. I've worked all over the place. Please, we exist. Find us. Let us help make your worlds more diverse and more accessible.
We will make your
Yeah.
story very pretty and also will be nice to you.
I mean, most of the time, right?
Yes.
Yes.
I would also say, if you're reading up on disability, if you want to educate yourself, please make sure that the people you're reading aren't just white cis-het disabled people, because the white cis-het disabled experience is not the entire disabled
Mhm.
experience. So make sure you're aware of that. Make sure if you're world building that you're aware of the fact that marginalizations intersect, and those intersections are incredibly complicated. as we can currently see with how disproportionately affected brown and black communities are in the whole COVID struggle. So please, please, please be aware of that and listen to other voices.
In other
Hashtag
words,
disability so white.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
in other words, what it comes down to is read widely.
Yes.
Read diverse works widely as much as you can get. And at that point, I think we're about to be out of time. So I want to thank my awesome panelists. You guys have been great. You've made my job very easy. And thank you to all of the different discussions going on in the chat. I'll hop over to the chat probably for a little bit after this, just in case we have further questions. Some of my colleagues may as well. And we just want to thank you for being here and willing to listen to us have a very in-deep conversation here. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. And the bumper's up. All right.